By 1985, the war between the Warsaw Pact and NATO nations was well and truly underway. In an effort to turn NATO's northern left flank, the Soviet High Command ordered an invasion of northern Norway. A force, the equivalent of 2 under-strength divisions, crossed the border and followed the E6 highway. The primary objective of this force was the city of Tromso. When this city was captured, the Soviet Navy would use it as a base to land reinforcements and heavy equipment. This would allow the invading forces to continue their advance south down the E6 highway towards the city of Narvik. But the Soviet land forces never reached Tromso. They were halted outside the village of Lakselv, another primary objective with a small airport. The Norwegian army, reinforced by the British Free Commando Brigade Royal Marines and elements of the SAS, made life for the Soviet invaders here very uncomfortable indeed. In an effort to regain the initiative, Soviet High Command ordered a change of strategy. The Soviet Navy was ordered to use the landing force to attack Tromso itself, capture the city and use it as a base of operations in northern Norway. The task force consisted of 8 vessels, with a Krivek 1 class frigate and a Grisha 3 class corvette far out in front scouting for enemy submarines. The landing ships were protected by 2 Cresta 2 class cruisers, and the landing force consisted of 2 Alligator class landing ships and 1 Ivan Rogov class landing ship, with the whole force being supported by a Kazbek class tanker. The Soviets had been led to believe that there were no significant NATO naval presence this far north. The Sjøforsvaret, the Royal Norwegian Navy, was very willing to punish them for having such a foolish belief, as they sailed to meet their enemy and defend their country.
Accept Operation Tromso.
Mottatt aeroklon Olatasområdet.
The Norwegians had gathered a force they deemed sufficient to deal with the Soviet naval threat. It consisted of 11 vessels, 5 of which were patrol boats, each armed with relatively short-range anti-ship missiles. The whole force was designated Task Force Narvik, and was indeed built around the frigate KNM Narvik, an Oslo-class guided missile frigate. The task force commander had split the force down into several parts, and against the advice of some NATO partners, had sailed forth for the Tromso area. On paper, the Soviet vessels far outranged and outgunned the Norwegian task force, but the Norwegian sailors knew how to defend their coastline. Despite being far out of range of any NATO support, Task Force Narvik was able to use the rugged coastal terrain to mask their approach towards the Soviet task force, which it transpired had zero idea that Task Force Narvik even existed. The main force, gathered around the frigates Narvik and Stavanger, had gathered in the Fjarnanien fjord, just north of the island of Shibuya. The fjord protected the ships from the prying eyes of the Soviets. The two groups of fast attack craft that had deployed ahead of the main force, and with each group containing 2 vessels, were masked by the island of Suðuroy, whilst the Norwegian's 2 Kolben-class submarines maintained contact with the advancing Soviet forces. These 2 attack submarines, KNM Utstein and KNM Kura, had managed to approach the Soviet task force by following in the wake of merchant shipping in the area, and both now lay in the direct path of the Soviet warships. It would not be long before the leading 2 Soviet vessels would be in range of Utstein's torpedoes, but unfortunately for the Norwegian forces, a Soviet helicopter was approaching the 2 Snurg-class missile boats as they themselves raced northwards from the direction of Silda Island. Both of these boats, KNM Rask and Rap, moved to engage with their 40mm cannons. Their well-aimed shots brought down a Soviet helicopter before it could spot the main Norwegian force. It is also likely that the helicopter had not spotted the Hulk-class boats standing by off the coast of Suðuroy Island to the north. But nevertheless, it was now or never, and the Norwegian counterattack was launched. Conveniently, KNM Utstein, having been out of communications with the main force, fired off a torpedo. The Soviet Krivak-class frigate was getting dangerously close, and without direct communications with the flagship, the captain of Utstein had to use his initiative, or else he risked his command being detected and coming under fire from anti-submarine weaponry. But the 2 Hulk-class patrol boats, waiting off the northwest coast of Suðuroy Island, and the 2 Snurg-class boats approaching from the south, now received orders to open fire when ready. But before they had the chance to move into a position from where they could fire, the Krivak 1 exploded. Utstein's torpedo had connected, striking amidships on the port side, causing an immense explosion and a number of fires to break out. The damage was devastating, and the ship began to list to port. And before long, almost the entire ship was engulfed in flame. The men aboard the fast attack craft, having first saw the flash and then later heard the explosion, reported what they had seen back to KNM Narvik, before going to flank speed and heading towards their targets, loosing off their Penguin missiles as they did so. These missiles had a range of approximately 19 kilometers, and though not particularly devastating in comparison to the larger NATO missiles and those used by the Soviet Navy, against a ship the size of a Grisha 3, they could cause shocking damage. And on this occasion, the Grisha 3's defensive armaments failed to stop the 2 missiles that smashed into the ship's hull, causing a number of secondary explosions from the ship's magazines and leaving her a blazing wreck. With the 2 leading Soviet vessels now destroyed, the 4 Norwegian fast attack craft had to move out into the open, because between them and the rest of the Soviet squadron lay a number of civilian merchant vessels. And from their original firing positions, they could not guarantee the safety of those merchant vessels in the event that the missile went astray. The 2 Hulk-class boats moved north out into the open sea, whilst the Snurg-class boats hugged the northwest coast of Suðuroy Island. Fortunately, their relatively small size meant that the 2 Soviet Cresta II cruisers found them difficult to detect. Unfortunately for the Soviets, all 4 of the Norwegian fast attack craft launched missiles at the leading ships of the Soviet squadron, which included both the Cresta II cruisers, all before the Soviets could even detect they were there. They knew the leading frigate had been destroyed by a torpedo, and the missiles that struck the Grisha 3 appeared to have come from the landward direction. As mentioned before, Soviet intelligence had failed to even detect that a Norwegian battle group was in the area. It was clear that Operation Trollfjorden had been a shocking surprise for the Soviet forces. The crews aboard the fast attack craft did not have to wait long to see the effect of their hard work, as on the distant horizon they saw the bright flashes of explosions as their missiles hit home against their targets. Both the Cresta II cruisers had received multiple hits, causing a great deal of damage and fires aboard both ships. The Ivan Rogov class landing ship had also been struck by a missile. But the Norwegians were not done yet. The 4 vessels now launched another barrage of missiles towards their targets. With the 2 escorting warships having both received considerable damage already, the Soviet squadron's defences against further attack was severely hampered, and the northernmost Cresta II cruiser received an additional 2 hits. And between the 2 Cresta II cruisers, an Alligator-class landing ship was also struck by a missile. The damage aboard the Cresta II cruisers was devastating. The crews were losing the battle to stop the flames from spreading. Both ships had lost power and were dead in the water, sitting ducks. Soviet crews aboard the warships now began to abandon ship, and KNM Falk of the Hulk class fired yet another missile, this time targeting the already damaged Alligator class landing ship at the front of the Soviet squadron. Everything that had happened so far had been reported back to Captain Marius Christensen, the commander of Task Force Narvik, aboard the frigate KNM Narvik. His ship, together with the frigate Stavanger, were fast approaching the action, having long ago left behind the corvette Aegir and the minesweeper Glomma due to their slow pace. All of the Soviet ships had now been struck except the Kazbek class auxiliary, but the Ivan Rogov, though ablaze, was still afloat, and the second Alligator class landing ship was also in a similar state. All 4 of the Norwegian fast attack craft had expended their missile ammunition and were now withdrawing west. The crews of the 2 frigates, now charging eastwards towards the remaining Soviet vessels, were cheering their smaller consorts as they passed. It was around about this time that 2 F-4 Phantoms arrived. Captain Christensen, aboard KNM Narvik, vectored them onto the already damaged but still underway Ivan Rogov class landing ship, and the Phantoms attacked along the length of the ship to devastating effect. The survivors amongst the crew quickly began to abandon ship, as yet another Soviet ship began to settle. And at last, the 2 Norwegian frigates were now in range to launch their missiles on the remaining Soviet vessels. It's worth pointing out that they too carried the same Penguin anti-ship missiles that the small fast attack craft also used, which would have left them outranged by the Soviet weapons if the Norwegians had given the Soviets leave to return fire. Several missiles were launched against the 2 remaining Soviet ships, both effectively defenceless against such an attack, and both received a number of hits from the Penguin missiles. The last of the Soviet landing ships was abandoned by its crew following this barrage, but the Kazbek class oiler, an auxiliary vessel, was still under power, having shouldered its way through these missile strikes quite admirably. Captain Christensen now ordered his ships to cease fire with their missiles. Narvik and Stavanger were to engage with their main guns. The Kazbek class oiler received hit after hit, causing the ship to lose main power and suffer a great deal of structural damage. Even the Hulk class patrol boat Skarov posed within range to engage with her 40mm cannon, and also in a coup de grace attack, the Skarov fired off a torpedo that would seal the Kazbek's fate. The Battle of Sevilla Island, often referred to as the Sevilla Island turkey shoot, due to the very one-sided nature of the battle, was cause for great stiller celebration throughout Norway, and indeed among Norway's NATO partners, from whom the most heartiest of congratulations were expressed. And the Norwegians had proven, in quite decisive fashion, that they could defend their nation and NATO's northern flank, and they'll do it alone if necessary. From this day onwards, the 26th of February would forever be an important date in Norwegian naval history, a holiday date for the entire nation, to remember and celebrate the day that they defended their nation. But for now, the war still waged, there was still a job to be done, and the Kongelige Norske Marine would be at the forefront of the fighting on the northern front of the war. Thank you ever so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video and this little story here. If you did, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a like so I know that people enjoy it. And don't forget to leave me comments as well, also telling me what you think and telling me what you might have done differently in the battle. I look forward to delivering the next part of this little story, so please stay tuned for that as Norway's war continues.